Welcome back to the McCoy Leadership Podcast, elevating your impact through valuable insights and conversations about leadership. Welcome back to the McCoy Leadership Podcast. We're super excited to be here today with Aaron Trahan. His executive experience goes back over 20 years, and he found himself as the senior executive of a billion-dollar company at age 30, which is quite an accomplishment. He has the ability of growing people, elevating teams and organization, and that lifelong passion has led him into a business coaching business. And Aaron, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'll flip it over to you and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Amos. Looking forward to a really valuable discussion here. And yeah, I think you touched the surface there. Leadership for me started at a pretty early age. I was able to scale that and kind of climb my way up to the corporate ladder of having some pretty consequential roles and executive leadership positions in a billion-dollar publicly traded company by the age of 30. And as my career progressed, and I realized almost by each passing year, the value that people leadership plays, it continued to be this gravitational pull that, really over the next, I would say, 8 to 10 years led me closer and closer to launching and developing a coaching business based on kind of the frameworks and the lessons and mistakes that I learned along the way that can help others really accelerate their businesses without acquiring all the scars that I had to. And so that's what I get to do now on a day in, day out basis.
So wait a minute, you said successes and mistakes. So you made a couple of mistakes along the way.
Just a few. And I kind of tell people my qualification of doing what I'm doing today is I'm fairly confident I've made just about every mistake in the world of leadership that you could possibly make. So I've yet to see a mistake out there that's being made that I haven't personally endured myself.
So well, I got to tell you, my first time managing people, I had a belief, which I think a lot of people did, that, once I had the title, that made me something special. I had no skills whatsoever. And I still remember telling a floor employee, well, you're going to do it because I'm the boss and I told you to do it. Needless to say, it didn't end very well for that relationship with the two of us, at least at that moment in time. We were later able to rectify that, but that was my first biggest mistake, and I made plenty more after that. So I just wanted to make a little fun out of that.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how those titles do not automatically qualify us as being great people leaders, right? It's kind of one of those, regardless of title or status or stature within an organization, the ability and capability to lead is, something that must be acquired, and it's a continuous improvement process. There's nothing static about it.
Absolutely. We do John Maxwell's Everyone Communicates, Few Connect. If you've not read the book, it's a great book. But one of the biggest pieces there that I always tell people is the great news is anybody can learn this. Everybody can get better at it. And sure, there might be some people, we look at them and say, well, they're better at working with people, connecting with people than what I am, but we can aspire to get there, and we should never quit trying to learn. So before we get into our real subject matter, I'm just curious, through all of those years and building different teams, did you find it more valuable once you were able to start to connect with people? Was it more valuable to have leadership skills out of a book, or was it more valuable to be able to connect one-on-one with those individuals as you were building a team?
Yeah, I think there's never going to be a substitute for taking the action, right? And I kind of tell people all the time is you can read all the books, you can listen to all the podcasts, you can attend all the conferences, but the magic gets unlocked is when you're able to put it into application across multiple real world scenarios. And the one thing you're going to find out is it will never be as clean and neatly packaged up as you're going to find in those books or the MBA classes or whatever it may be. It's much more messy in real life when we're dealing with people. And so I think it all kind of comes down to just making sure you're getting those experience reps in. For me, it was all around the real world action, and then being able to take a step back, zoom out, reflect on what went well, reflect on what didn't go so well. With hindsight, what would I have done differently in that situation? And then looking ahead, what's the things that I'm going to change? Be as specific as possible about those things, and then be relentless with implementing those changes. And then that's the rinse and repeat model. And so we're not launching rockets here. It sounds very basic, very simple. It is. The one trick about it is around the consistency. Will you keep showing up and running through that cycle over and over again? Because this is a continuous improvement game. It's not a set it and forget it. Things change, things evolve. Leaders have to adapt. And I think when you're not willing to adapt, make those changes, do the right reflections, it's going to show up in your leadership performance at some point down the road.
Absolutely. I like several things that you said there. And I think it's a great segue into jumping into talking about goals. And one of the things I found interesting when I was reading some of your material is that, the majority of goals that are created often fail. And even sometimes when we, at least in my experiences with myself, with my clients, sometimes even when we say they were successful, they really weren't successful. We've just decided that we can't get it any further and we're going to change our definition of successful, which is a whole nother issue.
That's right.
In your experience, what are the primary reasons that 90% of goals fail?
Yeah, when I look at whether on an individual level or at an organizational level, when you see a person and or team not meet the expectations of the goal, the vision, the initiative that they had set forward, just about, I would say over 90% can always be tied back to one or two. In some cases, it happens, both issues show up. I kind of consider these the big root cause buckets. And the first one is really around the tracking systems that are in place. And it's one thing to set a goal, but too oftentimes we can get fixated on the outcome. So if the goal is reaching the top of the mountain, too often we just stay fixated on that view that's on top of the mountain. When in reality is after that goal is set, that almost becomes the low priority, because yes, we may now know where our destination is, but our focus actually needs to go to the route to get there. And that's going to show up either on an individual or an organizational level around how robust of a tracking and measuring system do we have in place. If we want to be at this point in 12 months, well, what needs to be true over the next 6 months that keeps us on track? How does that then rewind back to what's the big focus for the quarter, then for the month, then for the week? And so knowing where you want to go is just a small part of the overarching mission around goal achievement. It's much more around how we get there. What's going to be the very next step? Where do we anticipate being, with those milestones along the way? And there's this one study that was really mind-blowing to me. I believe it was done by the High Performance Institute, where they took 19,000 individuals and really wanted to dissect what were the things that helped and hurt goal achievement. And one of the things they found in this study was they looked at two different cohorts of people. In one cohort, it was a group of people who had set a goal. The goal was clear. Everyone knew what the goal was, but had weak or no tracking systems in place to measure progress. They compared that to the cohort that didn't set a goal at all. And what they found was their performance was basically on par, which means having a goal but not having tracking mechanisms in place to really give you as close to real-time understanding on how you're progressing kind of means you're not going to perform any better than that group that didn't have a goal at all. And I found that to be really wildly fascinating. And as I look back on all of my um, goal failures, I can point to the exact same thing. I didn't have the tracking and measuring systems in place that helped me understand on a week over week basis, am I ahead of expectations? Am I meeting expectations, or am I falling behind expectations? If you don't have that, it becomes extraordinarily more difficult to achieve whatever it is that you're wanting to achieve. And then the second bucket, and this really speaks to the organizational level, is how strong is the connection between short-term priorities to long-term visions? I think we've all encountered organizations that face whatever you want to call it, mission drift, or they start being reactive, and all of a sudden we're fighting fires versus prioritizing the right things that make the right progress that we're expecting. And so it's easy for short-term priorities based on the fire of the day or what's happening from a macro or external standpoint to kind of get sidetracked, whether we're chasing perceived low-hanging fruit, we get distracted by other opportunities, whatever it is. But I think at an organizational level, the big thing that shows up is that short-term priorities, with hindsight, become pretty severely detached from where our long-term vision is. And I've seen in more than 90% of the scenarios, goal failure can oftentimes be tracked back to one or two, if not both, of these big critical elements on goal failure at an individual or organizational level.
So, big, huge corporations, one of their favorite things to do is to get together, have a strategic planning, and work through the process. I've conducted many strategic plannings also in the nonprofit world. And so we get all the executives in a room and we sit down and we say, where do we want to go? What's our mission? And we make sure our strategic goals are connected to our mission. And then over the past several years, we will start to say, now, wait a minute, we need to have metrics. And then we start to talk about leading and lagging indicators, which ones. So, in a simple example, we want, 500 new customers. And the way we obtain customers is through phone calls. So rather than tracking the customers, we're going to track the phone calls, and we're going to create quarterly goals. All of that lines up. But my question is, so the leadership creates the strategic plan. Should they really be creating what the metrics are and what is going to be measured? Or should we be bringing in folks from other places in the organization that have different expertise to help with that portion? Just a question.
Yes and yes, right? I think there has to be a top down and bottom up element to it, because a lot of the times understanding the high level strategic initiative can be a very different thing of what needs to happen, what must be true at a team or division level tactical standpoint to make some of those elements become true for the larger strategic initiative to see the progress that it's expecting to make. And so if too much is forced from a top down standpoint, then they could be missing. And oftentimes this is the case. Those at the very top are usually the furthest away from the details that actually need to happen at lower levels in the organization. And so they could be dictating the exact wrong things or things that don't make the right progress for the lower level teams. And at the same time, I think that's where there's this balance that has to occur. The bottom up standpoint can't drive it all either, because there are things that at the top levels of the organization, they're just going to have a different purview. They're able to see different things that those at the bottom of the organization or lower levels of the organization can't see, can't understand, can't comprehend, cause and effect analysis. And so I think it's the art and science of leadership is being able to have that delicate balance of enough insight from a bottoms up standpoint that matches to the strategic vision that's cascaded down from a top down standpoint.
Kind of on the same note, I have witnessed several times where smaller business maybe, and they work their way through. They go through a strategic plan. They come up with great strategic goals. They involve maybe middle management in coming up with what the leading indicators are going to be that they're going to track. And then they close that book. Well, they give the middle management, here's what you need to do. They close that book. And now the folks maybe that are out producing, or if it's a service industry, they're outperforming the service. They're now getting little bits and pieces, but never fully understand what the strategic goal actually is. So like in my example, we tell customer service, you need to make 25 phone calls every day, no matter what. That's your goal. We're going to track it. Right. And then they start to feel like, well, they're tracking everything we do. Next thing, they're going to track when we go to the restroom or, what have you.
Right.
Have you seen that as well? And what would be your feedback on how do we make sure, and in some cases, I guess the business owners or the board of directors, they feel that some of that information shouldn't be shared. Maybe there's something there. They don't want them to know that they're going to acquisition another business or anything like that.
Right.
But we still can't let people blindly go. I think it was in Ken Blanchard's 1 Minute Manager, I believe. He gives an example of you're going bowling and you roll the ball, and just before the ball gets there, a sheet drops down in front of the pins. You hear pins fall, and then a little guy jumps out and holds 2 fingers up. And now you're wondering, did I get 2 or are there only 2 left? And that's kind of what I have in my head, that sometimes we do all the right steps up to that point, but then we let everybody in the dark. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's such a common problem. And I think so much around leadership, and especially the businesses that I work with, whether they're founders or CEOs, I tell them up front that part of the responsibility of the role that you're in, one of your KPIs, your key performance indicator, is effective communication. And so that's not only driving what needs to happen, but adding the right level of context of why this is important for this team to execute this function. How does that then drive kind of a larger initiative to make them feel like what they're doing matters? They know why, and at least of a bigger picture scenario that's applicable to that team, that individual, that manager of that team, to where they understand the connection between us doing this, executing on this leads to this output, which is a key ingredient to the overarching organizational outcome. And so I think as a leader, when you miss adding that context in, that's where you start to have this friction that shows up in the organization, and too much top down kind of dictating of what needs to be done, with those that are being asked to do this not understanding why it's being done, which they're certainly not going to have buy-in. The execution is going to be subpar. And one of the things that I continue to see over and over and over again in businesses, no matter the size, is that when there's a strong enough why baked in with the context driven by leadership, teams and managers will often figure out how, right? When there's that why that's missing, they don't know what they're doing. This seems like a fool's errand. Leadership is way off their rocker. They're not seeing things the way that the frontline teams are seeing them, and what they're being asked to do is ridiculous. You're going to have gaps starting to emerge between expectation of execution from leadership versus the level of execution that happens at the team and tactical levels. And so, to the point that you bring up, context and transparency is everything. That doesn't mean that you got to share, the exact same information you're sharing with the board all the way down to lower levels of the organization. But I do think leaders must own the responsibility to make sure that the right level of context is given to the teams so that they have their why around what it is they're trying to do, why it matters, and how it rolls up to the overarching organizational initiative. When you don't have that, When that's not there, you should not have the expectation that your teams will be delivering world-class execution.
Great example. One of my clients recently, they had just switched to a new type of system, and through that process, of course, there were new things, there were new activities that needed to be done, and through that beginning, now, and sometimes these are natural things, but through that beginning process, there were many times where I was aiding and helping them in this process. There were some times that you would just say, hey, customer service team, you need to do this daily. And you didn't maybe explain why. And there was one of those that was a very simplistic task, but for whatever reason, it was never happening. And after talking with the management and the owners, I said, has anybody told them why this is important? And so we went back and said, look, if this isn't done every day, it skews things. And this is what it's skewing on your sales reports. And this is what, the intern, it causes a lot of extra work and as well, maybe some panic sometimes. Yes. And from that day on, it was done. There was never a question. And it was just getting that why to them because they looked at it as, it's just one more thing I got to do today. I don't want to do it.
Right.
Now, you also mentioned effective communication is a great KPI. I agree 1,000%. But I struggle. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions? How can a leader, a business owner, a manager, how can they start to measure that KPI? How do you get to a point where you can say, I've had a great week of effective communication or I've had a terrible week? What are your thoughts?
I've got a test that I like to, before I start working with any organization, I like to ask this question to the founder, CEO, or whichever leader I'm working with. And it's a simple question that goes like this. Imagine a scenario at which whatever your meeting frequency is, whether it's your leadership meeting, your staff meeting, when does that happen? And they'll say, oh, this is every Monday at 10 a.m. I'll say, great. What if that next meeting, so next Monday, I surprise the group by randomly showing up, and then I immediately go around the room and ask everyone in attendance 2 questions. Question number 1, what are the top 2 or 3 priorities for the organization and or this team? And question number 2, why is this a priority right now? What would happen? Here's what happens 9.9 times out of 10 when I ask these leaders have them walk through the scenarios. There's usually a pause. They sit back, and after about 3 seconds, they say, you're probably going to get different answers from just about everybody in the room. That's like, that's your gauge. That is always something that you can go back to understand how effectively you're communicating. Because if the team closest around you is not aligned on what the top 2 or 3 priorities are, and why these are the priorities for the business right now or team right now, how is it that you think that you're going to be able to generate greater alignment downstream to their teams and their teams of teams? And so it starts there. And I think there's no better question to ask that, to drive the alignment, to drive the transparency on what are the top priorities, why are these the priorities, then and only then can you start putting the pieces in place around the things that you were mentioning, the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes that make progress behind those priorities and those initiatives. But if that front piece alignment's not there, it's kind of insanity to think that if the team around you is not aligned and not clear on what the priorities are, how are you going to expect the right progress, the right traction, the right execution to be made at multiple levels, deeper down in the organization? And it's really an eye-opening experience just having leaders kind of walk through that. But I think that's the best gauge. It's kind of like, just do a simple poll within your organization, even at a skip level standpoint. Ask people, what's the top goal right now? What are the top priorities? And why is this the top priority? You'll find out everything you need to know on the other side of those questions in real time.
One of the things that I have seen in the past was a business owner. His business was very seasonal, and they worked a lot of overtime during the summer months. And he recognized that many times as you got to the middle of that period of time, morale was going down. And so he made it a point with his managers to make sure that they understood exactly what the goal was for the overtime that was happening. And to the point, they were a manufacturing company. They would talk about what jobs were happening, where they were happening, where their product was going to be used. And then he tied that back to part of the bonus system for the managers. But what he did was he would go to the floor and he would ask the guys, he would stick around until 6 o'clock in the evening and say, "Hey, do you guys know why you're working overtime this week?" And it started to kind of ensure that his message was actually making its way down. And I thought that was fascinating. I mean, that was a way of tying it to compensation or an incentive program as well. But he had a great gauge because he was asking the guys that were working on the floor, "Do you know why you're doing this?" And he said it only took a small amount of time before they started to, and they engaged with it, and the morale came up because now they knew, I'm making product for a new hospital, or I'm making product, and they could see how it impacted their own community as well. So it really flourished into a great, a great business, as well as a community within the business that they really bought into what they were doing. Ironically, their turnover went down as well because that was another issue that they had.
Well, and what I love about that story so much is it just continues to emphasize the point that we're making on the power of why, right? I mean, think about our own personal lives, and for your audience, think about the times you were asked to do something and didn't know why you were asked to do it. What was your buy-in? What was your commitment? What was the meaning and purpose you felt behind it? Speaking for myself, it was always low, right? It's like if I don't know why I'm doing something that I'm being asked to do, my natural tendency would be to almost kind of become defensive. Why are we having to do this? How does this connect to the mission? How does this move things forward? So anytime you lack a context or some type of transparency behind the why, you're not going to have the meaningful commitment. You're not going to be able to have the purpose that comes from a team, even at lower levels, where they feel that me accomplishing this task, no matter how rudimentary it may be, it's part of the greater good for what we're trying to achieve. There's meaning behind it. It's an input that generates an output that helps generate the outcome that the larger body, the organization, the team, whatever it may be, that we're looking to achieve. So I'm doing my part. I'm contributing in my way, in my level, from my team to help generate that outcome. But with all that being said, if the why is gone, it's just a pipe dream. You'll never get that reaction that you just mentioned and the results that come from that of greater execution, lower turnover, and more purpose from the team if the why is not communicated. And you can't expect teams at the lower level to sift through the organizational jungle and find the why themselves. This is the responsibility of the leader. This is the rent that's due for being the leader. And this is why I always say this is one of your most important key performance indicators as a leader, to ensure that the why is in place. Because if you're not going to do it, the teams can't do it themselves, right? And so I love the conversation around the critical component of why.
So, Aaron, if we have some listeners that are listening because maybe they just became a supervisor, they're in a beginning management position, they're in a company that does not do everything that we're talking about, how can they apply this in their own little ecosystem? So they're now a supervisor for 10 people in a business of 500. Would you believe that they could apply this at least within their department or what they're responsible for and still see results?
100%. And I've done this from experience early on in my career. Whenever, I didn't have the big senior executive title, I wasn't in the executive leadership team meetings. I think it's a completely valid and fair ask to fight for the clarity that you need that ultimately you can deliver to your team. And so if it's not being pushed down, I think it's totally within your right and to feel empowered to pull it down. And that's by simply having a constructive conversation with your manager, your boss, your leader, and say, hey, I'm really wanting to clarify and be more transparent with my team of 10 around why it is that our goals are our goals. Can you help connect some dots for me? I'm really wanting the experience and your viewpoint from your level to help me connect some dots that makes me a much more impactful leader of being able to distill down to my team the why behind what we're doing. And so I think the biggest mistake that you can make at a supervisor or manager level, that let's say the leaders are above you are not taking this KPI very seriously and not giving you what you need. My big challenge to you is do not settle. Do not just say, well, I'm not getting the insight and the transparency and the clarity on the why. So yeah, I'm just going to tell my team, sorry, I don't have the information. This is just what we got to do. I think this is your moment. This is an opportunity. And I would say fight for the clarity that you need, even if it's not coming, because that is what leaders do. As I like to say, leaders lead, right? And so regardless of title, regardless of status, I think this is something any leader can do. And even if you don't get the answer or the clarity that you're looking for, by at least being the driver of that conversation, of asking for those dot connecting insights from your manager or boss, I've never seen a scenario where you at least don't have more information coming out of that conversation than you had going in. So even if it only helps you by 1%, it still helps you by 1%. So I would say, fight for your team. This is what leaders do. Leaders lead. And so if you're having trouble distilling the why from higher levels above you down to your team to connect the inputs, outputs, and outcomes, I think this is your moment. This is an opportunity to kind of drive the conversation, and don't sit back and expect the conversation to come to you.
Yep, and I would suggest as well, if our listeners follow your steps there in that situation, they will also find that that information will come more freely in the future, and as well, they will, there will be many opportunities for them because they're showing what leadership really is.
Exactly.
Backing up all the way back though to tracking, it just hit me many times. Especially mid-sized businesses, small businesses, they get overwhelmed in this whole tracking idea, and you could spend days, if not months, looking at software and things that cost high dollar amounts. And at the end of the day, I have a belief that if you can't do it on paper, a computer, a piece of software, or something of that nature is not going to make it happen for you. Now, in today's world, when I say on a piece of paper, if that's a spreadsheet, that's fine.
Right.
But one of the most fascinating things that I have ever encountered was with a group that we had set some goals, and we were struggling with how are we going to track all the KPIs that we came up with. And what we decided to do was we took a large whiteboard on wheels and we put it in the hallway, and we created charts and graphs, but we allowed the employees that were doing the work to fill it in. So if one of those items, back to my original example, was phone calls, the people making phone calls at the end of the day could go over and color in the 10 phone calls they did. And what amazed me was how excited people were to go show and so by putting them in charge of it, but that was a very low tech way. And so my question is, to you, do we have to go with, fancy software and apps and things that everybody can have on their phone and all of those, all of the things that are out there, or can we go with a simple whiteboard? What are your thoughts?
Maybe it's the minimalist coming out in me, but I'm just a big fan that simplicity is always going to be the best route. And as a matter of fact, simplicity is a direct representation of how well thought out and thought through some of the goals are. Oftentimes complexity is just a way to cover up of, the goals not being clear or whatever it may be. And, I stress to teams all the time that vague goals deliver vague results. And so it is much harder to get goals down to its cleanest, clearest, simplest form than it is to throw out something highly conceptual or abstract that's tough to track, tough to measure. We think we need to have all these systems and visuals and things like that. Some of the best teams I've ever been on are just doing things off of a very simple, easy to read spreadsheet that creates quick, easily digestible, common language for the organization. And so I think by all means, if it's effective, do it. Don't try to overcomplicate something because you think this is what other big businesses do. I think whatever is most effective that helps the team or your business effectively execute and operate, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And so I'm a big fan of putting in the preparation and work to boil things down to its most easily digestible and simplest form. Because very few things work better when you add more complexity into the ingredient mix.
I would agree. I love receiving, when I encounter somebody new and they have a complex system that takes, 3 weeks just to figure out how to even find what my task is for the day or what have you. So, as we're starting to wrap up, if you had to put your thoughts about how we can create more achievable goals and or how we can flip that around and say achieve more of the goals we set, what would be the practical, actionable steps that you would lay out for somebody that is going to make the biggest difference in their goal setting, right now, today?
Yeah. I'll sum it up with 3 letters, and that's OKR. And that happens to be the management operating system that I help businesses implement simply because since the 1970s, this has been a system that's proven to be one of the most effective goal setting and execution frameworks leveraged by companies of all sizes, all shapes, all industries. And what OKR stands for is objectives and key results. Would be happy to share more, but it's widely available online. There's plenty of resources out there, but this is kind of the system that I help businesses implement that does this exact thing. And oftentimes when you see any type of business not meeting the expectations that they have, it can usually come back and is tied to these 3 areas. Ineffective prioritization, which then creates fragmented organizational focus, which then drives weaker than expected execution. And the objective and key result framework allows the organization to come together, create a common language that's widely shareable, widely transparent, to help the organization understand that these are our top priorities, the objectives. This is what we're trying to achieve during this time period. And the key results that support it is going to be how we're going to do it. And from those key results, those can get cascaded down to the different teams that then becomes that part that you're talking about, where the teams can generate their own ways of achieving that goal that's directly tied to the organizational initiative, creating a directly correlated tactical response to a strategic initiative. And so, yeah, I highly recommend all listeners, if you're not familiar with it, it's well within the ROI of the time spent to get familiar with it. And if you're already using OKRs, it's still worth it because, as I've seen, the reason I have a job is 80 to 90% of the companies that use this system aren't maximizing it effectively. They're not getting the most leverage out of it. So kind of go out and find the best practices, but around goal setting, execution, and creating the common language around prioritization, it's the single best system that I have ever seen. And it's been working since the 1970s. This isn't some new thought up thing from an MBA class. It was created by the kind of the godfather of management, Andy Grove at Intel, way back when. So highly recommend people become more familiar with it.
Awesome. So I have 2 more questions for you. We ask every
Yes,
guest. The first one is, what is the go-to book you have that has been around and on your shelf and you continually refer back to that helps you with leadership and management issues?
The one that's coming to mind right now, I would say, is Atomic Habits by James Clear. If I were ever elected president of the United States, one of my executive orders would be everybody coming out of high school would read this book, just because it's got such wide ranging applicability that closes the gap from both life and business of where you're currently at and the things you can do to kind of get to where you want to go. And it all comes down to, the habits and the systems we put in place to do what's required to get what we want. And so that's the book that, I just can't recommend highly enough.
Awesome. And should we take that as an official announcement that Aaron Trahan will be running for president in the future?
No, never.
And my last question is, what is your favorite piece of technology? What are you using today that is helpful either in your everyday life or in your business life? But what is your favorite piece of technology right now?
Oh, this is a good one. I would say, and I actually just did a LinkedIn post about this, and it's around a new AI app that's gaining a lot of traction called Perplexity.
Okay.
And this is just one of the most exciting and dynamic pieces of technology that I've seen. And it's really kind of a crossbreed between Google search and ChatGPT, where it has wildly increased my productivity, not only on personal matters, but also on business matters, where you're able to get to the answer of things leveraging this AI platform more so than I've ever been able to before. And if there ever was a Google killer type of thing, it's going to be this. And it's no surprise, I think Jeff Bezos is a lead investor in the company, and so they're just generating an immense amount of traction. And it's a wildly productivity enhancing tool.
Awesome. Aaron, thank you so much for spending some time with our listeners here this morning. Where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, two places I show up to the most is, as I mentioned, on LinkedIn. I'm extremely active on there. I'm always trying to pass along insights. I want, if anybody wants to connect with me or follow me, I want to be one of the most highly valued connections you have by just continuing to generate value for my community there. So I highly encourage, let's connect. Let's have a conversation. I'm always on LinkedIn. And then for a more deeper dive on how I help, my methodologies, the approaches at which I help businesses find performance breakthroughs, that's going to be my website. And that's just performancemindsetcoaching.co, no M. And I'll make sure, Amos, you have that to kind of link in the show notes. But those are the two places that I would point people to the most to find out more about what I'm up to.
Awesome. Thank you again. And until next time, don't forget to check out McCoy Leadership on LinkedIn as well, and check out our website. And we'll be coming out with a few more solo podcasts after this one. We're going to dive in a little bit to connecting with people. And then we have a lot of other interviews coming up in the near future as well. So until next time, thank you, and have a great week.